So yeah, I've been absolutely passionate about this subject ever since I was a school teacher. And I think there was a few experiences that I had that I kept having that made me start asking some searching questions about this topic. And one of those experiences was that I would notice these children. I worked in a non-selective school in a very selective area. So for want of more favorable words, some of the environment was pretty tough. It was all boys, pretty tough environment, low socioeconomic space. So we had a lot of children from tough families, lots from good families as well. But there are a lot of children that had teachers around them that would say things like, they've just got a terrible attitude. If only they would try a little bit harder. But I couldn't help noticing that I would see these children in some arenas. They would be looking pretty lazy and pretty demotivated and pretty disengaged. And then suddenly I would see them in different arenas and they would be completely different people. Suddenly they'd be engaged, they wouldn't be procrastinated, they had loads and loads of energy. And it just got me asking deeper questions about this idea of motivation. So, and some of those questions are here. Why do we seemingly have competing drives? One of my competing drives is, one minute I want to be an international businessman with loads of responsibility and working every minute of the day. And the next minute I feel like I want to be one of those guys that's just selling cocktails in the Bahamas and living on the beach and having a really relaxed hedonistic lifestyle. I've got those two competing drives, and lots of people seem to have them. And that same example that I just spoke about those children that seem energized in some arenas and completely de-energized in other arenas. What's going on there? Why do we have seemingly different levels of motivation in some spaces that we do have in others? And the biggest question for me, and this is the one that I spend a lot of my time when I work with individuals, when I'm coaching, is what explains the gap between what we know and what we do. And if I take you back to my teacher years, I would sit there disciplining a child for some bad behavior that they've been doing again and again and again. And I'd be asking them questions about what they think they need to do to turn their lives around and create better opportunities for themselves. And they all knew the answers. They all knew what it was they needed to do. But for some reason, their behaviors didn't match what they knew. And I'm sure there are examples in all of your lives as well. And health and fitness is the classic example for me. If we go around the room and we say, right, what do you think you need to do to get yourself into unbelievable shape that's going to make you live longer and thrive and all those sorts of things? We all know the basic answers to that. You might go and speak to Tina Mulders for some additional insight and knowledge to really tweak it. But basically, we know the answers. But why don't we do it? What's the gap between what we know and what we do? And there's some of the questions that I'm going to try and unpack today. Unfortunately, this is what's happened to me in all of my research and knowledge. And I've got a background in applied psychology, so I've got an academic interest in this area as well as a practical interest. But the more I learn about this subject, the more I realize I don't know about it. And I end up having many more questions than I do have answers. And it reminds me of this beautiful, beautiful graph. I'm sure you've seen it before, the Dunning-Kruger effect. As we start to learn a little bit more, and I've definitely been on this journey, and I've done talks about motivation many, many times before. And a lot of those talks, I was on the up part of that graph, where my confidence was really, really growing as I talked to people about motivation and what it was they needed to do to find more of it. And then, particularly when I did my master's degree in applied psychology, I hit the peak of Mount Stupid, and I suddenly realized how little I really know about the subject. And I would probably say that I'm going in that direction with it. The more I know, just the more complicated it seems to get. So I'm definitely not sitting in front of you as an expert in communication, but somebody who's just really, really interested in it and just wants to keep finding out more about it. So what are some of the reasons for that confusion? Well, one of the reasons is there's so many different ways of exploring this topic. And there's a tiny arena of exploring this topic. Cognitive neuroscience is different to cognitive psychology. And those different research bodies can explore it in different ways. And when you explore it from one particular angle, you find a different set of assumptions and a different group of answers. Some of those answers might contradict what evolutionary psychology talks about motivation, which might contradict what social psychology says about motivation. And what we know from the science is that you can pretty much go and find evidence from any of the different sciences to prove a position that you already hold. And there lies a lot of the confusion around helping us understand this mysterious gap between what we know and what we do, how we find more motivation in ourselves, and also how, and there's a lot of leaders in the room I know, how we help other people find more motivation so that they can become more engaged. But all of these disparate sciences can create confusion and also provide opposing answers to that question of where we find it. And I love this quote from Steven Pinker, who says, every theory of education needs a theory of human nature. So where do you post your flag in the sand when you decide to go about trying to engage yourself and engage other people? What are your assumptions? And one of the things that started to happen very, very recently is that some of those different arenas of research have started to converge and started to find some common ground where those findings start to make sense. So some of what we're learning in neuroscience and cognitive psychology and studying genes are starting to converge on a few similar ideas. And today what I'm going to do is I'm going to present to you in a very humble way, because I'm saying here, I've still got more questions than answers. I'm going to present to you some of that convergence on what we think might be happening in this idea of motivation, where you find it and how you get more of it. So, quick definition for you. What is motivation? It's a driving force or forces responsible for the initiation, the persistency, that grit and resilience, and direction and vigor of goal-directed behavior. And I've underlined the word forces there, because one of the big mistakes I think people make when they think about motivation is that they think of it as a unitary concept. They think of it as something that we either have a lot of or we don't have very much of. We think of it in terms of amount. How much motivation do you have compared to how much motivation does another person have? But thinking about it just in terms of amount, in terms of just one source, I think is the beginning of an unhelpful way of thinking about motivation. A more helpful way of thinking about it, based on what we think we know, is that actually we can find motivation in so many different spaces. And exploring all of those different arenas is something that we're going to do a little bit about today, and something I'd really, really encourage you to do, rather than painting yourself with a broad brush to say, oh, I'm just a demotivated person, or oh, I'm a procrastinator, or oh, I'm a lazy person. I hear those sorts of things quite a lot. Actually, in some spaces we might be, but in other spaces we're not. So we're going to explore the variety of places where we can find it. So for those people that have done our coach training program, they will be familiar with this theory. And I'm going to share two different theories today around human motivation. And I did a degree in applied psychology. So it's not just the theory. I'm really interested in, okay, so what do I do with this insight? What do I do with this knowledge? And I'm going to place a little bit of that responsibility on your shoulders today around, okay, how do you take this knowledge and apply it? So the first piece is self-determination theory. It's one of the most rigorous pieces of research in human psychology. It's survived across generations. It's survived repeated testing. So they did the tests 30 years ago and they got similar results to the tests that they got 5 years ago and 3 years ago and 1 year ago. And it's work by a guy called Edward Deci and hundreds and hundreds of other researchers in the space as well. And Deci basically says human beings have got 3 core needs that we need to be satisfied in order for us to be optimally engaged. I'm going to do a really quick overview of the three of them, but today we're actually going to focus mainly on the one at the top there. So these three key needs are a sense of autonomy, which is this idea of a feeling of volition and control over what we're doing, a sense of mastery, the feeling that we're getting good at things, and then this sense of connectedness and relatedness, being cared for and caring for other people. So we've got these three fundamental needs, and you're probably looking at those and thinking, yeah, okay, that sounds about right. Yeah, I'm pretty engaged when I get to be effective and useful, and yeah, I'm engaged when I'm around people that care about me. But this idea of autonomy is the one that I'm going to focus a little bit more on today. So let's paint the picture of what autonomy really means. One of my favorite stories it's actually from an A-level sports psychology textbook. So imagine Bob, who's in his retirement years, and he loves watching daytime TV, absolutely loves it. And he's sitting there and he's living in a cul-de-sac area in the suburbs, and he's got a few neighbors. And he's got this beautiful patch of grass outside of his house. And there's three little children that have just moved in next door, and they are obsessed with football, absolutely obsessed with it. But they don't really have a very good space. Their garden's a bit of a mess. And they love playing football on Bob's garden. And they use the big brick wall of his house as the goal. So he sits there trying to watch his daytime TV. And these three little kids spend hours on hours kicking this ball, tearing up his garden, smashing it into the wall, and really disturbing him. But Bob knows a thing or two about psychology. And after the few days of getting pretty frustrated and asking them to leave, and they just won't leave, he decides he's going to play a trick on them. So he goes out there one day and he says, lads, I've been watching you play, and I'm not going to lie to you. Wow, absolutely incredible. I'm so impressed with what I've seen. And it was sort of coming to the end of the day, and he knew that they were about to go home. It was about 6 o'clock in the evening for their dinner with the family. And he said, just before you go, I want to give you guys $5 each for your performance today, because wow, the performances were just absolutely astonishing. So here you go, well done. And he gave them each $5 each for their performance. Anyway, of course, they were just absolutely made up, couldn't believe their luck. Of course, they came back the next day, ball down on the grass, tearing it up, kicking it up against the wall for hours, causing mayhem. And I've just had a note that around audio, so it sounds like it's working for most people. So anyway, the kids come back onto the field, and there they are playing football and having a whale of a time. And he waits to the end of the day, and decides that he goes out there and says, guys, again, I've been watching you play, unbelievable performances. Do you know what? I don't have as much money on me today. I've only got $4 each for you, but still brilliant. The kids are pretty pumped. They're pretty excited, just been paid to play football. Anyway, of course, they come back the next day and carry on playing. But each day they come back, he keeps reducing the amount of money to the point where on the last day, boys, I've been watching you play. Unbelievable. I'm really sorry. I've got absolutely nothing to give you. And the kids are absolutely furious. And they say, do you know what? We are never coming back to play football on your garden again. And Bob had won. And what Bob had managed to do is he'd managed to change the reason why they were there. Where previously they were there for internal reasons, that intrinsic motivation, he had changed that, what we call locus of control, to an external reason. And he had decided to reward them with some financial incentives to play football. So now they were doing it for the money. And then the moment he took that external reason away, he'd undermined their intrinsic motivation. And now all of a sudden they had lost the enjoyment of playing just for the sake of playing. So Bob knew a thing or two about the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. There's a lot of people that may have heard of this idea before, and definitely if you've done the coach training program, you will have heard about this. But what I'm going to do today is I'm just going to take it into a deeper level for you. So, because there's actually some nuance between being externally motivated, doing it just for the reward, and intrinsically motivated, doing it just for the love of the activity. So What's external motivation? External motivation is doing something just for the sake of the reward or the threat of a punishment. So that carrot and stick idea. It's the least effective motivator, particularly for certain situations. And I'll talk about those in a minute. So it's the weakest form of motivation, when we're motivated just because we want to get an immediate reward or avoid the threat of an immediate punishment. But there's a few more gaps, but there's a few more stages between external motivation and intrinsic motivation. Introjected motivation, now we've moved a bit further up the continuum, and we're getting a little bit closer to intrinsic motivation. Introjected motivation is you're doing something not because of the fear of a threat or an immediate reward, but maybe because you want to avoid some sort of shame, or you're trying to gain the approval of others. You might have been inspired by somebody that you've just met, and you might want to try and improve them or impress them or win their approval. So you might suddenly have a burst of motivation. That's what we call introjected motivation. But we can still move up, getting a little bit closer to that intrinsic motivation. We have something called identified motivation. We're still not doing it because of that deep satisfaction, that deep feeling of reward that we get just from the activity itself. But we do recognize that there's a value in doing it. So we might have just started going to the gym. We know that it's good for us. We're not really enjoying it, but we know that there's value in it in the long term. So we persist because we've identified it as an important piece. So that's what we call identified motivation. And then all of those are still extrinsic. They still have that weakness factor of being extrinsic motivators. Of course, the holy grail of motivation, according to this theory, is this idea of intrinsic motivation. We're doing it for the deep satisfaction and enjoyment of the activity itself. And that's where those little boys were when they were playing football. They just loved that feeling of kicking the ball, the feeling of striking it beautifully, and that fun they were having when they were playing. That's why they were really doing it. And that's when our motivation is intrinsic. But there's a couple of other pieces that are probably worth pointing out here, is the difference between controlled motivation and autonomous motivation. So identified motivation is still autonomous. It might be extrinsic, but we're still in control of it. And that's a really, really important idea when we think about motivation. Unfortunately, and this is a personal opinion that I'm going to share with you, and I'm sure I can find some research to back it up, as I said earlier on. But this idea of controlled motivation and autonomous motivation and extrinsic and intrinsic motivation is really under threat. Sorry, not the idea is, but our intrinsic motivation is under threat from so many factors that exist in life. So for example, social media, LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, we are often, when we're searching for those likes, we're often outsourcing our intrinsic motivation, right? I'm not climbing that mountain for my own good. I'm climbing it because I want to get those likes. And it's a really dangerous place, particularly for young people at the moment who are very, very sensitive to the drivers that are happening around them. And they are outsourcing previously intrinsic motives to the approval of their friends through how much engagement they get on their social media platforms. That's a really dangerous area. In fact, I think schools, there's a lot of things that happen in schools that undermine intrinsic motivation. And one of the obvious things is assessments. I used to be a psychology teacher, and I'd have children that would come to my classroom at the beginning of the year to study psychology, and they would come because they were so excited about learning about psychology. And by the time we'd hit them with a few really serious assessments, slowly but surely, their reasons for being there started to change. And I'd have children saying, "Sir, please, can I have a higher grade? Because if I don't get that higher grade, I'm not going to get into that university I need to get into." Their reasons for learning were no longer for that love of the subject. It was slowly to get that extrinsic piece. So this idea of extrinsic and intrinsic motivation is really, really, really important. So one of the key insights here, and this is a question that I'll ask you, is how can you internalize your behaviors. It's possible, let's say that you want to start moving your body a little bit and eating a little bit healthier and getting that's an obvious example that I'm going to use. You might have no intrinsic motivation for that, but it is possible for you to start at the bottom of that continuum and gradually move along that continuum to the point where it does start to become rewarding just for the sake of it. So a big question for you all is, how can you internalize your reasons for doing those activities? Because the moment you get to that fully internal place where it's fully intrinsic, then all of a sudden you're doing it for those deeply rewarding and satisfying reasons. Now, when we talk about intrinsic motivation, it connects to a few other big ideas. Now, I'm not going to talk about purpose today because we've talked about it before, and I'm not going to talk about flow either. We've talked about that before, but flow, very quickly, for those people who don't know, is that state of deep engagement that you get when you're inside an activity and you're so immersed, you just lose track of time. It's a state of deep engagement. And when we're intrinsically motivated, we can find those states of flow. And obviously purpose is doing something that's meaningful to you, and you have deep reasons for doing it. All of those things are connected to intrinsic motivation. And there is one beautiful story written by Mark Twain. I don't know whether anybody ever read The Adventures of Tom Sawyer by Mark Twain, written back in 1876. And Mark Twain, when he wrote this, knew something about self-determination theory 100 years before it was developed. Tom Sawyer is a naughty little boy, and he's a mischievous, a lovable rogue, but a mischievous little boy. And on one Saturday afternoon, when it's meant to be his free time, he has been lobbed with a punishment by Aunt Polly to paint the fence that goes all the way around the outside of the house because of a misdemeanor, of a piece of bad behavior that he'd done during the week. And obviously Tom Sawyer is absolutely gutted that he's got to spend his afternoon painting this ridiculously massive fence. But Tom Sawyer, clever little lad, knew something about motivation. So what he did is he told all of his buddies that he's going to be painting this fence this afternoon and they should come round and check it out. But he didn't tell them that it was a punishment. And when they came round to watch him painting the fence, which for Tom was an absolute chore, what he did is he pretended that he was really enjoying it. And his friends said, "Hey, Tom, what are you doing there? What's going on?" And Tom said, "Hey, guys, this is called art." And they were like, "Whoa, what do you mean?" "Yes, it's art. I'm painting this fence. It's really enjoyable, and it's called art." And yeah, and they said, "Wow, I'd love to have a go. Can I have a go?" And he said, "Well, you can, but it's going to cost you." And they were like, "Oh, please, can I have a go? Please, can I have a go?" And he said, "Well, okay, well, if you pay me a little bit of money, I'll let you join in and paint the fence." So Tom gets his buddies around. They all pay him, and he sits there, feet up, and all of his friends paint the fence for him. So what was previously a chore suddenly became play. And I love this piece of language from Mark Twain. Work consists of whatever a body is obliged to do, and play consists of whatever a body is not obliged to do. So we can see that idea of how extrinsic incentives can undermine intrinsic enjoyment. So there's a little bit of piece about self-determination theory and how it works. So before I go on any further, I'm just going to pause there for a moment and ask if anybody's got any questions that they would like to ask, just to help them understand that concept. And also what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go backwards a couple of stages here. I'm going to put this slide up on the screen, and I'm going to throw you into a breakout room and just give you an opportunity to interact with some other people in the room. Now, some people might be in a place where they're not able to interact and there's things going on around them, but I'm going to throw you into a breakout room just for 6 or 7 minutes. And your job is to do the applied piece of this theory. So what can you take away from this continuum of extrinsic moving all the way up to intrinsic motivation? What can you do with that piece of knowledge for yourself, or possibly for people that you lead and that you work with? And I'm going to give you a chance to have a brief interaction with the people around you. Okay, so Are there any questions before I throw you away? It's just going to be a quick 7-minute. It will be the only breakout room that we do, and it will be interesting to see about your discussions. I'll put 5 or 6 of you in a room as well. Some of you might find you're in a breakout room and people don't turn on their cameras and they're not engaged because they might have slipped out. So just a really quick conversation with people around you. Okay, great. I was just saying, I hope your conversations were as good as the conversations I've just had. I've just had 2 beautiful insights. I'm just going to share them really quickly. One from Andrea, saying that most of his job as a leader is to take instructions that have been passed to him and internalize them to make them meaningful for the people that he works with and for his teams. I thought that was a beautiful, almost definition of leadership. And then Mandy, who is the head teacher of a school, was talking about a little bit of research that she'd heard where almost 80% of the communication that we hear is in the form of a command, that command control, telling people what to do, which can rob people of that intrinsic motivation. I thought that was a really, really powerful insight. Thank you very much for those ideas. So here's the next piece. So that was part 1. That was part 1. So this is where these ideas merge now. And I'm going to share with you what is potentially quite a controversial arena of research in psychology. And actually it's what we call personality psychology. And some of you might be thinking, why are we talking about motivation why are you introducing personality psychology if the topic is motivation? And I'm going to try to make the link between these arguably 2 different arenas. And the reason why it's controversial is because when we talk about personality, it's very difficult not to have a debate about this nature-nurture idea. Where do we get our motivations from? Are we born with a certain amount of motivation? Do some people have more of it than others? Are there certain areas where we find it that we can't change? Are some people predetermined to find motivation in certain arenas than others? And these are the sorts of questions that come out. And by the way, it can get really complex, but I'm going to share with you a high-level idea to try and provoke a little bit of thinking about how our personality traits can affect our motivations. So here's a few questions. Here's a few ideas about what we think we know about personality, okay? And by the way, this is disputed research, and some of you might be thinking, well, wait a second, I've read stuff that sounds different to this, and that's fine. So let's present the case. Personality traits are meaningful, and this is the big word, stable, as in they don't change very much, partly genetically inherited, consistencies in how we behave. Okay, it's a really powerful sentence when you think about what I was just talking about a moment ago. It's also argued that we can measure our personality traits, and it's also argued that they have predictive power when aggregated over many instances. And what that means is it would be impossible to say that, oh, because somebody is an extrovert, we know that they will say yes to the invitation of a party tomorrow night in one instant. They might say yes, they might say no. We don't know whether they will or not. So we can't predict how somebody will behave in one instant. But it does have predictive power over time. So if you said, here's an extrovert compared to an introvert, if they both had 100 invitations to parties over the course of a year, who would say yes to more of those invitations? The chances are that the extrovert will probably say yes to more of those invitations over time than the introvert will. Okay, so that's what it means by predictive power aggregated over many instances. And we'll talk a little bit about why that's meaningful in a second. Now, this is potentially a scary looking slide that can get really, really complicated. It's not my goal to complicate it. I will dive a little bit into a rabbit hole, but I'll bring it back to something that's really meaningful. So there's a lot of people in this room that have probably got experiences with DISC profiling or MBTI or Clifton's Strengths. But in the psychology world, in the psychology lab, actually psychologists spend more of their time talking about what we call the big 5 personality traits. And all of those other profiling tools are basically underpinned by this. So this is pretty much what proper psychologists talk about when they talk about personality traits, as opposed to some of those other more commercial tools. And the 5 traits that personality psychologists have discovered are these 5 that I'm going to share with you now. So one of those traits is what we call openness. And it describes, and it's a continuum, by the way. And sorry, let me just back up for a second. What these traits basically say about human beings is, on the one hand, they explain why we are all similar, because we all have these traits, but they also explain why we're all unique, because we all exist on different places on those continuums. Okay, and as you can see, there are an infinite number of different combinations. So openness is one particular personality trait, and it describes people who are low in openness as practical, conventional people, and people who are very, very high in openness are our creative people, our imaginative people, our eccentric people, are people that love to travel to different countries, and they love art, and they love all of those creative endeavors, and they're energized by those. And I've used the word energy deliberately because that's my link to motivation. Conscientiousness describes how orderly a person is. At the low end of conscientiousness, we have people who are, and remember, up to 50% of the variation in our personality traits is described by genetic variation, and there's a relative stability about this. So conscientiousness describes people who are, or low conscientiousness people are disorderly, they have poor impulse control, they always forget their keys when they leave the house. And then people that are very high in conscientiousness, very orderly, strong impulse control, very disciplined. Extroversion and introversion, more of a, we've heard of this word before, so introverts, quiet, de-energized by large groups of people. High extroverts are outgoing and energized by social variability. Agreeableness is a really interesting one. It describes the relative warmth of a person. People who are very low in agreeableness tend to be direct, they compete rather than cooperate, and they protect their self-interest. Simon Cowell on the X Factor, low agreeableness, doesn't have a hard time having a tough conversation with somebody. And then people that are high in agreeableness tend to, somebody's just asked me, who are the purple spots? They're not me, because if it was me, the one on conscientiousness would be really, really low. People that are high in agreeableness, they tend to put other people first. They are socially warm, harmonious people. And that idea of putting other people first is interesting. Remember that example that we used earlier on? In 100 situations where they are making a decision to put somebody else's interest before their interests, over 100 times, they might make more decisions that puts other people before them, okay? And obviously that can play out over a long period of somebody's life. Neuroticism is sometimes described as emotionality, very high, emotionally sensitive, potentially emotionally unstable, very low, emotionally very stable. The red lines that I've drawn takes personality psychology into more what we call pathology areas. So people that are at the extreme levels of those typically have some sort of are almost susceptible to some sort of mental pathology in that area. Okay, so as you can imagine, very, very high emotionality it can be problematic for people. Very, very, very low conscientiousness can be problematic. And what we know is that these traits can predict certain outcomes in people's lives. So for example, people high in extroversion are more likely to have to experience marital disharmony. Now, it's not because they're more promiscuous. An introvert and an extrovert might both perhaps have, let's say, for example, might both be in an unhappy marriage. But the extrovert, because they're saying yes to more social environments, the extrovert is coming into contact with more people and more other extroverts who also happen to be going to those social gatherings. So there's more of a chance that they might meet another person, perhaps. So these ideas do have some predictive power. So why am I explaining to you this in the form of motivation. And no doubt you're going to be really interested, oh, where do I fit in those areas? Where do I fit? So why am I talking about this in terms of motivation? Well, imagine those continuums are like a swimming pool. And imagine those lanes of the swimming pool have got currents that are running through them. So in this lane, the current's running in this direction. In this lane, the current's running in that direction. Imagine some little fans built into the wall there. What that means is when we behave and we're operating in one particular lane, we're with the flow of the water. So what that means is we can sustain our energy in that water. If we're swimming against the flow of the current, we find it really hard to go against that grain. And that's where we might struggle to find sustained levels of motivation and energy in one particular domain. So and that's a simplified version. Imagine a swimming pool with hundreds of lanes, because those traits are actually much more finely defined, okay? But nevertheless, they have a flow to them. And if you're operating against that flow, it's going to be much harder for you to sustain energy and sustain drive. Now, you might be thinking, okay, Pete, yeah, I get that. I've done psychometrics before. I get the idea. I might have even done Clifton Strengths Finder with To Be Limitless. I get the idea of that flow. However, there is a modern denial of human nature built into our language frameworks, and it's there all the time. Okay, so I'll give you a little example. I'm going to throw my personal trainer under the bus right now. I said to my personal trainer yesterday, I said, mate, I'm doing a presentation on motivation tomorrow, and let's talk about it, 'cause it'll warm my brain up a little bit. And he went, okay, yeah, let's talk about it. I said, right, motivation, what do you reckon about it? And he went, rubbish. I said, whoa, what do you mean rubbish? And he went, it's not even a thing. I said, well, wait a second. Well, what do you mean by that? And he went, it's all about discipline and consistency, Pete. And I said, okay, discipline and consistency. Well, where does your discipline come from? Well, you know, it's just about hard work and effort. And I said, well, tell me a bit more about hard work and effort. And then he paused and he went, well, you know, maybe it's, you know, if you're passionate about something, you're probably going to have more effort for it. Okay, so where does your passion come from? And then he paused for a moment. And then that was the piece where we started to ask ourselves questions about, okay, so are you naturally passionate in some areas than other areas? Do you have some predispositions in those traits? And then our conversation went down a rabbit hole. So let's talk about this modern denial of human nature. So it's this idea of separating effort and hard work from traits, which I've just spoken to you about. Here's the great philosopher, Will Smith. I've never viewed myself as particularly talented. By the way, talent is the innate stuff, the natural stuff, the traits. I've never viewed myself as particularly talented. Where I excel is ridiculous, sickening work ethic. You know, while the other guy is sleeping, I'm working. While the other guy is eating, I'm working. It's the separation of what's innate from our effort and our hard work. That's what Will Smith has done in that sentence. It's not about talent, it's about hard work. This is an absolute classic. I see it on LinkedIn all the time, and I have to bite my tongue so hard not to become one of those LinkedIn people that joins in those silly discussions. Another example of the modern denial of human nature. I see this post all the time. 10 things that require zero talent. So again, it's the separation of what is innate, our traits, and our energy. Being on time, having a good work ethic, effort, energy, body language, passion, doing extra, being prepared, being coachable. Well, wait a second. We already know that people exist in a different level in terms of their conscientiousness. So some people actually maybe do find it a little bit harder to be on time. Some people do find effort in different places compared to other people. So is it as simple as separating? Is it as simple, David Labouche, is it as simple as separating our motivations from those innate dispositions? And I've got another example. So Angela Duckworth has written a very, very popular book called Grit, Why Passion and Resilience Are the Secrets to Success. And there's another book by Matthew Syed called Bounce, The Power of Practice and the Myth of Talent. And these are arguments, and they're convincing arguments that are arguing against pretty much what I'm saying here about the power of traits. So Angela Duckworth, in her research, again, it's another diminishment of trait and innateness. It's a diminishing of it. So her formula for achievement is talent. So she accepts that innateness exists, times effort. So there's already a separation of effort and talent equals skill, and skill times effort equals achievement. And therefore, effort counts twice as much as talent. But in that process, what's happened, it's another separation of where we derive energy and our hard work from anything that's innate. Is it possible that those two things are more connected than we think? The other one, very similar piece of reading, and I was obsessed with this book when I first read it, but I learned to find holes in it. The Myth of Talent and the Power of Practice. And what both of those books have done is they've used examples of high-performing people that have achieved incredible things in their lives, and they've noticed that they all have something similar in common. They've all persevered at something for long periods of time. Effort, resilience, and grit and motivation. And then therefore they've said, well, it must be effort, not talent. But unfortunately, there are an equal, if not more, number of people who have also put similar amounts of effort, motivation, and hard work into things and have not achieved great things. So in their research bank, they have been selective with their research, and that unfortunately means that you can't claim the non-existence of a variable like innateness or traits. So let's take my swimming pool analogy a little bit further. You've got two swimmers and they're swimming in lanes next to each other. One swimmer's swimming against the flow. The other one's swimming with the flow. One of them stays in the water for ages and they just keep going and they swim for hours and hours, and the other one gives up after minutes. Pretty easy to say that the one that gave up after minutes didn't have the motivation, didn't have the energy, and didn't have the drive. Whereas the one that persevered for a long time, well, maybe it had something to do with their traits. And I see that happening a lot, particularly when I was a school teacher. From the big five, this is just conscientiousness, and some people are higher up on this than others naturally. That's right. So I think that swimming pool analogy speaks huge amounts to me. So how do we get into the lane that's right for us? And when we're in that lane, suddenly we find energy that really works for us. And I know that life is not as simple as that, because there might be a goal at the end of the swimming pool that requires you to swim in lots of different lanes. Okay, so that does add a level of, okay, personal exploration there. These, for me, are two completely different memes. Again, I see them posted all the time. The one on the left, for me, is a rejection of anything that is innate. Okay, so success is just about hard work, persistence, late night, rejection, sacrifice, discipline, criticism, doubt, failure, and risk. Okay, well, that, for me, is a really unhelpful message, because there's a lot of people that bang their heads up a brick wall and do all the late nights and persist, and they burn themselves out, and they don't get to where they think they want to be. Why? Well, maybe it's because they're swimming against the flow. That, for me, is just a burnout message. This meme on the right-hand side is, for me, makes a lot more sense. Don't judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree. And what that does is it acknowledges those unique differences in people, recognizing that they have different traits that find energy in different lanes. So there is our swimming analogy. So here's a simple way of thinking about it. And let's even give Angela Duckworth her due by saying that effort, and I'm allowing her to separate effort from talent and traits here, even though I personally don't think that that's appropriate. But I'm going to give her that anyway. So let's say effort is twice as important as traits. So there you go. Effort's got twice as much in our success journey as traits has. But if we were to flip that on its head and imagine that it's a skyscraper and the traits are like our foundations and our effort is how tall our skyscraper can climb into the ceiling, bearing in mind we want our foundations to be built on something that's relatively stable something that can withstand all of that effort, it makes sense to me that we build our achievement on top of what is relatively stable about our traits. Now, it's an unpopular thing to talk about sometimes. People don't necessarily like the idea of relative stability of traits. And there's a few reasons for that. One of the reasons for that is because it invites people to do this. It invites people to say, oh, wait a second, it wasn't me. It wasn't me. It was just my low conscientiousness. That's the reason why I turned up late. It wasn't me. It was just I'm predisposed for aggression, which is why I lashed out the way that I did. So the people that criticize anything to do with innateness and trait theory come at it from, there's two different ways to criticize it. One, to criticize the research that it's based on, which is absolutely fine. The other criticism is they feel like it gives people excuses. But I don't think that that necessarily is the case. So if we take the example of, we know that some people have different physiological responses to carbohydrate intake and fat intake. We know that two bodies can eat exactly the same foods and do exactly the same amount of physical activity, and one body will respond completely differently. One body will be predisposed to obesity, one body will be predisposed to early onset of diabetes and other conditions, and the other body will not be affected by it so much. So recognizing that, you can't just say, well, you know, it's just the way that I'm built, I'm just going to have to eat all the rubbish and I'll just have to be, no, there's no excuse, is there? Actually, what that tells you is that I need to be even more careful. I need to be really, really sensitive about what I put in my body to make sure that that doesn't happen to me. Okay, a basketball player who happens to only be 5.5 feet tall can't walk out onto the court and just say, well, it's just not fair, I'm not tall enough. They've got to think carefully and strategically about how they're going to position themselves in that arena so that they can be most effective. They might decide to go and play in a different arena, or they might just decide to be strategic about what talents they do have. Okay. So, team, actionable takeaways. The first piece, when we talked about self-determination theory, is this idea of how can you build motivation in self? And the big one is, from self-determination theory, is this idea of internalize it as much as possible. And it's a really tricky thing to do when we're surrounded by groups of people who, even sometimes with their best intentions, can accidentally behave in a way that externalizes your motivations. Really, really important to recognize that internalizing motivations can make a big difference to intrinsic motivation. And similarly, how can you as a leader build motivation in others? And just thinking back to what Mandy shared in the breakout room, 80% of the communication, she said, comes in the form of a command. And this is the reason why we're encouraging leaders to become coaches and move away from advice giving, because in that moment of giving advice, what we're doing is we're externalizing somebody's reason for doing something. So we're really encouraging leaders to coach people as much as they possibly can. And there's a beautiful model that I'll show you on the next slide called the GROW model, a very simple way of shaping a conversation with people in your team. So my challenge to all the leaders out there, and I know there's a few people that have done the coach training program and you've gone through this process, my challenge to those other people is the next time somebody comes into your office and they want some support from you, see if you can coach them. See if you can sit in that conversation for 10 minutes without giving them an instruction. Unless, of course, it's absolutely necessary and your instructions might save the day or prevent a catastrophe. But see if you can just ask questions, okay? I'll show you what that GROW model looks like in a second. And then the other one is finding your swim lanes. Find your swim lanes and try not to beat yourself up too much around things. And I often hear it, oh, do you know what, Pete, I'm just lazy. Do you know what, Pete, I'm a procrastinator. Well, I always challenge that. I bet you're not in some situations. I bet there are other situations where you never procrastinate. So really figuring out your swim lane. And if you can get into that lane, all of a sudden it doesn't feel like hard work anymore. But also recognize that when you're in your swim lane, it can potentially come with vulnerabilities. Okay, and what we know from those people that have done Clifton Strengths is we've got basements and balconies. We know that when we're in our swim lane, when we're using our strengths, we can be at our best, but it can sometimes come with a little bit of a cost to it as well. So for example, people that are very high in conscientiousness, which, by the way, high conscientiousness predicts success across most professional arenas, because turning up on time and completing your tasks is a prerequisite to being effective in the workplace. But people that are high in conscientiousness have a cost to that. And one of the costs is that they can lack flexibility and adaptability when things are changing around them. Okay, so our swim lanes have ups and downs. So recognize what your vulnerabilities are as well. If anybody's interested, and again, I'll share these slides and this whole thing's going to be on YouTube and we'll share the link. If anybody has got, wants to do some further reading around these ideas, particularly around that nature nurture idea, here's a couple of ideas. So the two at the top, the blank slate and personality, what makes you the way you are, they're the ones that really endorse the relative stability of our traits. And the two books at the bottom will give you a different argument. And obviously we know it's really good practice to not just read stuff that satisfies our own preconceptions. So the two books at the bottom will give pretty compelling arguments that go against trait theory. Okay, the book on the left, Why We Do What We Do, is the self-determination research, and it's an absolute classic. The other thing I'll say about these books, and that's something I'd really encourage you to do with your reading, is that these books are not written by reporters who report on research and then share their ideas. And there's a lot of self-help and pop psychology that is written by reporters. So I'd really encourage you, if you can, to just do a bit of prior research on what you're reading. So all of the books that I put in front of you are actually written by researchers, as opposed to a reporter that's gone out there and they've got an idea and then they've gone specifically to look for research to satiate their own position. And if you wanted to do a Big Five personality assessment, there's a link at the bottom, which I'll put onto the chat group right now, and it's free. And you can go and take the Big Five personality assessment. That's just in the chat group there for you. I've just sent it to David Labouchere by accident only. You can take that. And also we do have, a lot of people have done Clifton Strengths Finder, and you know that To Be Limitless deliver that particular piece. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of my presentation. I did say I was going to show you the GROW model, so take a screenshot of this one. Next time somebody comes into your office and they say, "Boss, Shane, I've got a problem. What am I going to do?" I'm going to challenge you to say, "Okay, so tell me the goal here. What is it you're trying to achieve here?" Get them to talk about the goal. "Okay, so tell me what's going on at the moment. What's the actual reality on the floor at the moment? What's going on?" "Well, this, and this." "Okay, so give me a couple of ideas about what you could do." "I could do this." "Give me any more ideas?" "I could do this and this." "Anything else?" "Oh, this, and this." "Okay, so you've got a few ideas there. Option 1, 2, and 3. Which is the one that you think you're going to go and do?" "Right, I'm going to go and do option 3. Brilliant. They've internalized their actions. They've internalized their motivation. It's a really simple coaching tool that you can use to have better conversations as a leader. Peter Turner's going to stop talking, even though I do sometimes enjoy the sound of my own voice. When I coach, I sit and listen for an hour. So I'm starting to get a scratchy voice. I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to open up the floor for any questions if you want. I'll do my best to elucidate around them, and maybe other people might have some answers to some of those questions as well. And if there are no further questions, I'll bid you adieu. Chris Hunt, unfortunately, needs to drop off, which is a shame. He's probably one of the most inspirational people I've ever met in my entire life, and I love him. Chris, say goodbye to everybody. Everybody wants to hear your voice before you go.
Bye-bye, everybody. Pete, thank you so much. That was a great session. We had a really good dropout room, and really, I think are all sort of witnessing the same challenges. So it definitely resonated a lot, and it's food for thought. So thank you.
Cheers, my friend. All the best.